All right. Now, we are live again here with the one and only Adam Clayton Powell the third. Again, Black royalty and Black legacy. The son of the great Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the late great congressman and Black politician, one of the greatest Black politicians, if not the greatest Black politician of the 20th century, and if not all time, if you will. So let's get right into it right off the bat. First of all, welcome back, Mr. Powell.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right. Let me ask you this question. It's the 60s. Let's just go ahead and set the stage, right? It's the 1960s. And it's during this period that I think your father makes his greatest impact. I mean, because this is the age of television. He's certainly become more visible. He's an advocate for Black America. My grandmother swore by him. She loved herself some Adam Clayton Powell, and because sometimes we would have these discussions, and I asked her. She said we were talking about. I think it may have been Clarence Thomas, and she was like, "Oh God, somebody needs to assassinate his ass." And she talked about what Adam Clayton Powell meant for her generation, and the impression and his legacy as far as his generation. Now, in the early 60s, John Kennedy becomes president, of course. What is your father's career like at this time when John Kennedy walks into the White House?
In January of 1961, when Kennedy became president, my father was still being blocked as to be chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee. He had the seniority to be a committee chairman, but he was blocked by the Southern segregationists, in particular Graham Barton, who I believe was from North Carolina. And as part of the agreement that he made to support President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy for president, he said that he thought that it would be only just and proper that he be given the same respect and position in Congress that the white segregationists had for their members of equal seniority. And Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's younger brother, was the campaign manager. And the two of them met. And my father described to me afterward, he said, I told him that this man Nixon is really strong, and Jack Kennedy is not going to become president without the support of Negro voters. That was the phrase, that Negro voters. And that they're not going to get the support of Negro voters without my support. And so, I remember 4 years earlier, he'd supported Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican candidate, because he thought that Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic candidate in 1956, was still beholden to the Southern segregationists. So it was not certain by any means that he was going to either support Kennedy or even be active at all in the 1960 campaign, at least for president. So he said that Bobby Kennedy said what he said to many people in meetings about his brother's campaign, which is, well, I have to take this to Jack, meaning he didn't think he could say yes. But there was a code that they used, according to my father, that if you couldn't say yes, what you could do was accept a cigar and have it lit. So my father offered him a cigar. Robert Kennedy accepted the cigar, and then he lit it. And so he knew that he had a deal. So Kennedy becomes president, and my father became chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee, one of the most powerful in Congress, and one where he surprised many, if not most, of his colleagues by becoming one of, if not the most active committee chairman. In fact, later, President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, after he became president, he sent my father a letter saying that he was the most effective committee chairman in the history of the United States Congress, period.
Let me see if I get this correct. Let me see if I have this correct. Your father passed a whopping, 60 bills
He
within a
never lost.
5 year period and never
He,
lost
he,
one to the floor.
he never lost a vote. And it's amazing why no one has written about this that I know of. But he had a very simple system. Um, he was all but banned in Las Vegas because he could count cards. Well, he could also count votes. And so he would look around. I was with him on vacations from school, and I'd watch him just looking around the floor of the House of Representatives, and he would say, "Ah, I need three more votes. I'm going to go over there and see my good friend from so and so, and I'll get his vote, and then I'll just need two more." Whenever he had a majority, oh, and what he had a jacket that was made too big for him by a tailor, and in the pockets of the jacket, he had rolled up copies of bills that he wanted to introduce. And what he would do is he had as many as four bills in his pockets, so that he would be looking around the floor. And as soon as he reached a majority for any one of those bills, he had a deal with the Speaker of the House that he could walk to the center of the House chamber and say, "Mr. Speaker, I introduced the Higher Education Act of 1965, and I ask for an immediate vote." And the speaker would say, "The gentleman has asked for an immediate vote. Will the clerk call the roll?" Now, the bill is sitting there in the hopper. He had circulated copies of it so that people knew what they were voting on, but he never lost a vote because he knew he had the votes before the vote was held. And so that's why all those votes, aid to higher education, fair employment, the original OEO, the original War on Poverty legislation, federal aid to Howard University, federal aid to Catholic schools. All these were not guaranteed by any means to be passed into law, but by persuading some um, some of his colleagues who were reluctant, um, he was able to get all of those bills passed.
When I look at it, and I'm contrasting this, and maybe this is not a fair comparison, but I'm contrasting it to the election and the tenure of our first African American president, which is, of course, Barack Obama. And I look at what your father was able to accomplish. And then I look at the Obama presidency, and I look at uh, the obstructionism of the Republican Party, what has been called the obstructionism. And it marvels. I'm shocked that Adam was able to uh, get through so much legislation in a period of course, we're coming out. Let's be fair. We're coming. This is the period when we're in Jim Crow segregation. We're coming out of that, certainly with the civil rights movement. But he's able to get through more legislation. He's able to get through more bills. He's able to get through more pieces of legislation that benefits working class people and African Americans and all Americans versus the Obama presidency. And it's like, well, we couldn't do it because of the Republicans. We couldn't do it because of the Republicans. We couldn't do it. I mean, that's the line that we hear all the time. Couldn't do it because of. I'm like, well, how in the hell is it that Adam Clayton Powell was able to get through all of this legislation in a period of intense opposition from well, which at that time would have been the Democrats as they became Republicans later on. He was able to get through this legislation despite the period, despite the time. And so I look at it, and I'm going to ask you this question: is it fair to say, and I've said this plenty of times, he was arguably more powerful as a congressman to me than Barack Obama was as president?
Well, to be fair to Obama, and somebody, I forget who now. He said if Obama had what Kennedy had, which is Lyndon Johnson by his side, who was the master of the Senate, was the title of his biography, and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. in the House of Representatives, he could have gotten a lot done. But I mean, we live in a more polarized time. But as you point out, in 1960, segregation was still very much not just a force in the South, but also well represented by the most senior members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And my father recognized this. He used to campaign in Harlem. He was elected first time in 1944. He used to campaign in Harlem by saying, "Send me back. Send me back." It's what the Southerners are doing. Send me back. I'll get enough seniority that I'll get more and more and more power. And that's what happened. He took advantage of that. But also to your point, he was. I remember Barbara Jordan from when she was first elected, African American elected from Houston. She came to see my father and said, "What's your advice? What should I do as a newly elected black representative?" And he said, "Well, there are 535 people up here, and each one of them thinks that he or she should be president, or at least be the Speaker of the House or the President pro tem of the Senate. So what you need to do is have a gimmick, and if you have a gimmick, that can get you attention, it can get you publicity, it can help you fundraise." And she said, "What should my gimmick be?" And he said, "You have that wonderful voice. You should use it. That wonderful voice that is the equal of any here on Capitol Hill." And she said, "Well, what's your gimmick?" He said, "Oh, I'm smart."
That's a hell of a gimmick to have. You have to be smart to increase the budget. I think at that time they increased it from what 450 million to 10 billion dollars under his reign as the chair of the Labor and Education Committee. Is that correct?
Yes, and sometimes it's bit by bit. I mean, you take whatever steps you can. The first war on poverty legislation, the Office of Economic Opportunity bill, was, I think, the title of the first one. The Southerners said they would not support a bill that meant $1 billion for, and they would use the N word, including on the floor of Congress. Um, and so my father said, "Okay, it'll be 900 million." and and so he was able to peel off a few votes. um, but watching him from when I was on vacation and when he would go to the floor of the house, there was no C-SPAN then. I couldn't watch on television. I'd follow him, and there wasn't the kind of security that we have now. In fact, if you go look at the history books, there was so little security in the House of Representatives and on Capitol Hill that some Puerto Rican nationalists were able to walk in with pistols, and they shot up the House of Representatives chamber, including shooting some members of Congress. And interestingly enough, they didn't increase security very much after that. So there's no problem with my walking into the congressional chamber with him, and I would stand in the back. Let me think. It's the back left corner of the House chamber as you're looking at the speaker, which is where the Democrats would caucus. And my father would lean on the railing. There was a high brass railing. He would lean on the railing and he'd be looking around, looking for votes. And there was one bill, I forget what it was, but he said, "I want to get this thing passed today, and I'm 5 votes short." And he looked around. He said, "Oh, my good friend, I'm going to go reason with my good friend." He goes over, and the guy's sort of shaking his head. He offers him a cigar. He takes a cigar. And he came back and said, "Okay, now I'm 4 votes short." He said, "Oh, I see another one of my friends I can reason with." And he came down to being one vote short of passage, and he really wanted to have it done that day. So I forget why. So he's looking around. He said, "Oh, my good friend from it was either Mississippi or Alabama." I said, "You're not going to get that segregation, diehard segregationists to vote for this liberal piece of legislation." He said, "Well, there are wonders to be performed, and with some help from, you never know what you can do." So he walks over. The guy sort of pushed him away. No, 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 no. And then he offered him a cigar. No, 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 no. Then he leaned over and said something. And I looked at him. Mm, 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 mm. My father came back. So what happened? He didn't get his vote. He said, "No, but he agreed to leave the floor when the vote was held. So now I'm okay." I said, "What did you say to him?" He said, "Well, there are going to be some changes in the electorate in your state. And there are going to be a lot more people who don't look like you who are going to be going to the polls. So your choice. I can either campaign for you or against you. Your choice."
That's what you call one of those good old offers you can't refuse, right there. That's some Don Corleone stuff
Right.
right there. Don Vito Corleone. Let me make you an offer you can't refuse.
Right.
Well, let me ask you this question. It is said, or it is alleged, that Adam Clayton Powell got reelected without spending a penny. I heard him make that statement. And Harlem activist Marion Logan also made that statement. She said Adam would just come to church and tell people how they were supposed to vote. And those people would go back into the community and tell the rest of the people in the community how to vote. And as a result, he would get reelected without the heavy burden of having to raise, these campaign donations and whatnot. How true was that?
Well, I do know that there are probably some election records somewhere, but I do know that he said that he didn't have to spend any money to campaign because he was always out with the people. And if I didn't tell you this last time, I'll tell you now. I can remember on Saturday nights, we would walk down, we'd start at the corner of what was then 7th Avenue. Now it's Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, corner of 7th Avenue and 138th Street, and walk south we'd start on the west side and walk south. And he would stop in all the bars and beauty parlors and, every place where there were crowds of people. And sometimes before they broke up, my mother would come too. So it's just the three of us, no entourage, not a whole bunch of guards, just the three of us. And and people would come out even before we could go into some places. People would come out and say, "Oh, Adam's coming! Adam's coming! Oh, Adam's coming!" And I remember one night there was a guy sitting on the curb, uh, and he was drinking out of a brown paper bag. So you can imagine what he had in the brown paper bag. And he saw my father coming. He said, "Oh," and he struggled to his feet. He was real unsteady. He said, "Oh, Adam, here, have some, have some." And out of nowhere, we thought we were alone, but it turned out we had plainclothes cops who were following us in the shadows we didn't know about. And they came running out. My father said, "No, no, no, it's okay, it's okay." The man's offering me a drink, and he put his arm around and said, "My man, you know, I really don't want to. Thank you so much. It's very generous of you, but I really want to have it all saved for you, if that's all right." I said, "Oh, thank you." And I hug. He sat back down on the curb. That's the style of campaigning, as it were.
That's what you call real politic, as they would say. Well, let me ask you this too. He would also hold sessions on the streets of Harlem as well.
Oh yes, oh, yes. There was one that I remember. It was really hot. He wanted to hold a session somewhere that would be accessible to everyone, and so he held it literally in a street, a congressional public event, a hearing I think it was on 117th Street. He held it in the middle of the street. They built a platform, and they had witnesses. And I remember looking up, and there were people watching from the fire escapes on both sides of the street. And it was, and the other thing he would do is before having that hearing or some other public events, is he would invite Dizzy Gillespie or somebody else to play. And so there'd be a crowd there for Dizzy Gillespie, and then he would walk on.
Wow. Well, and that brings me to my next question. Of course, we're in during the era of the Kennedy administration. John F. Kennedy will be subsequently assassinated. At this period, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. is at the height of his influence in Congress at this period. Of course, the March on Washington happens. Can you give us a bit of the, let's say, backstory of his involvement or not involvement or non-involvement in the March on Washington?
He had misgivings in the 1960 campaign. Martin Luther King and others were planning a series of protest marches, and he thought that was a terrible idea. He said, this is going to be a close election. Why are you going to endanger this? And oh, by the way, if Kennedy wins, we all win. And perhaps the most controversial thing that he did was to tell Dr. King that my father, was sufficiently opposed to protest in the 1960 campaign that he would make certain that there were accounts which may or may not have been true. I assume, I think in retrospect, they probably weren't true. That Dr. King and Bayard Rustin, one of the organizers of protests, who was an acknowledged homosexual, had a relationship. And I remember one person in a church office saying, "Oh, Adam, that's not true." And he said, "They make stuff up about me all the time. That's worse." And I know that Dr. King is going to be persuaded that this is not a good idea. So now you fast forward to 1963, 3 years later, and Bayard Rustin is, in fact, the person who was the central organizer for the March on Washington. So there was, to coin the phrase, no great love lost between Rustin and my father. But interestingly enough, the following year, 1964, Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King decide not to have protest marches during the presidential campaign. Why? Because they really wanted to make certain that Barry Goldwater was not going to be elected, the Republican candidate. So it's interesting. There have been various historical things. Now there's a movie on TV called Rustin. And I wish that they had gone, which ends with the March on Washington. I wish that the history had gone another year. Why did King and Rustin change their minds and decide not to hold protests, which was certainly my father's advice, that it was too important to not narrow what I mean. Nowadays we think, oh yes, LBJ, huge majority. You go back to 1964, and certainly if you go back to 1963, before President Kennedy was assassinated, the 1964 election was by no means going to be a landslide. The Kennedy people were quite worried about Goldwater or Rockefeller or Nixon, whoever was going to be nominated. And they thought they had a tough fight on their hands. and so I think it's an interesting bit of history that you had the hugely successful March on Washington, which I mean, I remember they called out all kinds of military and other forces, not to protect the marchers, but because they thought there was going to be crime. And of course, there was like zero, not just zero crime. I think that the general crime rate in Washington plunged that day. Um, but um, um, but interestingly enough, my father and the Abyssinia Church were huge participants in the march. I forget how many buses the church had. I was on one of them. We had trains going from Penn Station down to Washington. It was a huge, huge. I don't know how many thousands of Abyssinia members went, but it was a huge, huge deal. But then you go to 1964, and uh, mass protests recede. They come back after the election, but during the campaign, you didn't have the kinds of large protests uh, uh, that some had urged in 1960.
One of the things I liked about your father was that even though he was a Democrat, he always remained. He may have wore the letter of the Democratic Party, but in spirit, he was truly independent. And Adam Clayton Powell had the reputation of telling it like it is. One of his critiques, indeed, of the March on Washington, and that's why I'm bringing this up, was that he had a degree of consternation about the control that liberals wielded over Black organizations. This idea that liberals should hold sway and dictate policy objectives in terms of Black organizations. They should be able to, tell us where we should be focusing and where we should not be focusing. That wasn't going to work with Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Um, he
Absolutely.
believed in Black people determining their own goals, their own objectives, what people would call self-determination. Speak a little bit about his independent nature, despite him being a Democrat.
Well, you have to go back to the 1940s when he was first elected. He actually ran in the Democratic primary and the Republican primary and the Liberal Party primary. I think he ran in every one of the primaries and won them all. So come November, there's no opposition. um, and he, before Goldwater in 1964, uh, a lot of Black voters voted Republican. It was the Republican Party. It was the party of Abraham Lincoln, party that freed the slaves. And you look at the number of the percentage of voters who voted for African American voters who voted for Dwight Eisenhower. It's pretty substantial. So um, being able to be independent was different then. It was still unusual and considered outrageous by some. Um, but it was a different time when the Democrats still were the Democratic leadership in Congress was mainly segregationist. And so it made all the sense in the world to work with Republicans. That's where your base votes were for a lot of the civil rights legislation. Um, but you go forward, and I'll just tell one more. In 1956, after he supported Dwight Eisenhower for re-election, Eisenhower wins. He wound up having a lot of very quiet, unpublicized impact in the Eisenhower administration that neither he nor Eisenhower wanted to talk about. I remember going with my father to the Oval Office to see um, President Eisenhower more than once, and you're not supposed to repeat. Maybe that's out of date, but there used to be the rule that you couldn't repeat what the president said in private. Um, But Eisenhower was quite clear. He said, Adam, neither of us can be uh, have our fingerprints on this. It has to come from somebody someplace else. We can both make it happen, but we can't be linked to it. So he had that. So in 1958, the congressional election after 56, the Democratic Party um, leaders wanted to punish my father and throw him out of office. So they nominated someone to run against him, very well financed, and they thought that this was a way to either get rid of my father or have him under more of their control.
To humble him.
Yes. So I was in Paris with my mother the day of the New York Democratic primary, and in those days, you couldn't book a phone call. Not many people. There weren't that many telephones in Paris. You had to have influence to have access to a telephone.
Seriously?
Yes. Oh, yeah. The wartime shortages were still very much in effect.
Wow.
I mean, my mother was the big vedette Americaine, so she had some pull and she could get a phone. But still, to book a transatlantic phone call took days sometimes. So instead, you communicate by telegram. And so when the votes came in, my father sent a telegram uh, uh, to my mother in Paris, and she opened up the telegram and she just burst out laughing, and she just showed it to me and said, "The people won 3-1." He didn't have to say I won.
Wow. The people won. The people won.
But again, to your point, his independence and his support of uh, African Americans controlling Black institutions, that was a big deal. He said, I love B'nai B'rith, but they're not going to elect a Black Christian as the head of B'nai B'rith. It's a Jewish organization.
You
Fine. It's
damn
fine with me.
right. You damn right. Absolutely. You damn right.
So he said, so we should have, our own people running these organizations. And that was pretty controversial because there was, and is, a lot of white money going into Black organizations. And they were saying, well, why does he want this to be, all controlled by them? Now, we're their friends, but why does he want it to be in control of everything?
Imagine
that
that.
was controversial.
Imagine Black people in control of their own organizations.
Right.
That's heresy, right? His critique, Adam Clayton Powell's critique, makes it into history through the mouth of Malcolm X.
Malcolm and Stokely Carmichael and others. My father had this, he created this phrase, the Black Power movement. And, it must have been, 66, 65, 66, when others began to use it. And he said, hey, they've taken my phrase, and they're not even giving me credit. But he and Malcolm were not just friends and political allies. He invited Malcolm to come to the pulpit of the Abyssinia Baptist Church. And the deacons, some of the deacons, I don't know about the trustees, I was in a board of deacons meeting, and some of the deacons were saying, you're bringing that man to our church? And he said, yeah, listen to what he has to say. Don't read what you see in the papers. Don't pay attention to what you hear on the street. Listen to what he's saying. And so Malcolm comes to Abyssinia, and his message is respect yourself, dress well, be polite, and do whatever is necessary to make progress. But that was that was controversial. Um, Now it was 1964, I guess, when Malcolm was shot and killed.
65, 65.
65, sorry. Um, so you're talking about the first half of the 60s um, when a lot of the civil rights history hasn't happened yet, and you're talking about some pretty early days. Um, but I'll, I'll just fast forward for a quick anecdote. I put a non-commercial TV station on the air in San Francisco in 1990, full power broadcast from San Jose to Santa Rosa, and the idea was to be a completely multicultural community television station. And it was a PBS. We were a PBS member, but we carried very little PBS programming. And we did an open call. Okay, anybody who wants to have a program, documentary, or drama, whatever, please send in your tapes. So we had hundreds of tapes. San Francisco is full of filmmakers, and the two that I remember most vividly, one was from a Muslim bakery in Oakland. It had a number, bakery number so and so, and they had a talk show, which you're not talking about a big budget, but they were talking about some real issues. I said, well, okay, so this doesn't have the budget to meet the press, but they have some interesting community people talking about real issues, and that was sort of my father's view of Malcolm, except that Malcolm was really polished, but uh, but you make connections with the community.
Well, there's that photo, the famous photo. There's several famous photos of them together, and I think there's one where Malcolm is standing against the wall. There's
Mhm.
another one with, I think, Malcolm X, Adam Clayton Powell, and the late Dick Gregory, the late great Dick Gregory,
Mhm.
and he actually calls himself, Malcolm, and your father, the Three Musketeers. uh, and he speaks quite fondly of their relationship. Um, what was Adam Clayton Powell's influence like in Harlem during the early half of the 60s? And was that I don't want to say a rivalry, because that's the wrong term. Was there a sort of competition? Let me say it that way. Was there a sort of competition in terms of influence in Harlem between your father and Malcolm X? Or did it work in tandem? Did they pretty much work in tandem, or were there reputations and were there influence, sort of jockeying for position in the fixture of Harlem
No,
politics?
I don't think that there was any competition. They were in different spheres, and there was a lot of overlap, obviously. But they certainly respected each other, and but Malcolm was doing things that and attracting followers who my father couldn't, and vice versa. They didn't. I think I told you in the previous program we did. There was a regular conference call of the head of the NAACP, head of the Urban League, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, um, and my father and others. Um, and they would sit down and plan strategy together. Malcolm was never on those calls, but because he was not part of the so-called Big Seven, but he had a role which uh, my father respected, and quietly they would work together. They, they the network of people with whom my father worked was astounding. And I saw it because I would tag along on weekends. He would take me to these meetings on Saturdays, and he might be meeting with I don't know, Nelson and Lawrence Rockefeller. What are they talking about? Well, Nelson. This is before Nelson was governor. They'd be talking about politics, but Lawrence Rockefeller was talking about development. And oh, my brother Winthrop, he's going to go to Arkansas. What can we do in Arkansas? And my father would say, well, there are a lot of African Americans, and or I guess in the 50s he would have said Negroes, a lot of Negroes in Arkansas who need help. And, well, let's see what we can do. And so there he is working with the Rockefeller brothers. He There's another meeting. Oh, I'm going to forget the name now. One of the richest families in America. And it was, okay, what can we do to help the Negro people? And I gather this was a conversation or a meeting that was unlike most of the meetings that these wealthy people were having. But it was always, this is in, my father saying, this is in your interest. This country is changing. You want to be part of that change. And sometimes, I think it was Winthrop Rockefeller who became governor of Arkansas and invested in a lot of his family's fortune in a lot of property in Arkansas. And he said, now, you really want to help some of the people, some who are going to be your constituents, and you're going to do the right thing, and you'll do well by doing the right thing, won't you? So, and these are meetings that have never been reported, but I would just go along in these things. We used to. Lawrence Rockefeller built resorts in Puerto Rico, Dorado Beach, and in the Virgin Islands, Canal Bay, St. John. These nowadays you think, oh, that's obvious. Of course, Puerto Rico is a big deal. Puerto Rico was not at all a certain moneymaker. In fact, the first time we went to Puerto Rico was with a member of the Hilton family. I don't know if Conrad Hilton was on the trip or not. And they were planning the Caribbean Hilton in San Juan. They were so uncertain whether the hotel would ever make money that the blueprints they had were drawn up so the Caribbean Hilton Hotel could be turned into a hospital. Well, it became a hugely successful hotel, but that was not by any means certain. So Lawrence Rockefeller comes in and he builds Dorado Beach. Well, Dorado, if you go west from San Juan, Dorado is this beautiful beach, a wonderful bay. The next bay over is Cerro Gordo. So my father buys a fishing shack, and I mean a fishing shack. We're not talking about even having windows. It had chicken wire openings in the wall. If a hurricane's coming, you put up wooden shutters to keep the water and the air and air conditioning. Forget about it. And my father loved it. The shack was up on stilts, but he was working on his autobiography, and I was there. I wound up typing most of his autobiography, atom by atom, because I was the only one who could read his handwriting. And so he would write things out in longhand on his yellow legal pads, and then I would type them up. And a hurricane was coming, or a storm. I don't know if it became hurricane. And so somebody from the Rockefeller family called and said he didn't have a phone, but they could. There was a phone a couple of miles away, and somebody could run over to the shack and say, Congressman, you're wanted on the phone. And the governor of Puerto Rico always said, you need a phone in that place. And my father said, no, I don't want a phone. So he went down, and somebody from the Rockefeller brothers was calling. He said, your storm is on the way. You can't stay in that little shack sitting up on stilts. The whole thing could blow away. So come over to Dorado Beach, which is just down the road, the next bay, still under construction. It wasn't open yet to the public, still under construction. He said, "Come over to Dorado Beach. Um, we'll take you to an air-conditioned room in a secure concrete structure, and you can keep working there. And the power may go out, but at least you'll be safe." So we go down the road, and that's where we spent a couple of days and nights working on his autobiography. Um, One night he had a microfilm reader, um, and one night he had the frame from the New York Times archive of my grandfather's obituary in the New York Times, and he was looking at it, and the power went out, and then the power came back on a few minutes later, and he looks up and he grabbed my arm. He said, "Do you see what I'm seeing?" I looked up, and it was his obituary from the New York Times. And we looked at each other, and I said, "I think the reader advanced by a frame when the power went out." And so he put it back a frame, and sure enough, there was his father. It turned out the New York Times had an obituary ready to run for, whenever he died.
Wow. The New York Times.
But you can imagine being there in the dark, and the lights come back on, and you look up, and there's your own obituary.
There's your own obituary. Let's get into some of that, because that's what I want to ask you. We're going to go into that now. We've discussed his success as a congressman and as the head of the Education and Labor Committee. Um, did Adam Clayton Powell Jr. have a rivalry, as it has been depicted? Did he have a rivalry with Martin Luther King Jr.?
Uh, to some extent. He, he thought that, for a start, that Dr. King and others did not give him credit for the bus boycott in Harlem. He said, Rosa Parks, wonderful woman, but we did that in Harlem, and no one seems to remember that. They want to think that they want everybody to think that they invented that idea. They were both. You're asking just after I told a story about the New York Times obituary. They were both very much media figures, but in very different ways. The New York Times and other publications, white publications, they really favored Dr. King. They thought that Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was they used adjectives like flawed or complicated, meaning we don't completely approve of his methods or of his life. And if you go back, my father died 4 years to the day after Martin Luther King was shot and killed. And if you go back and look at the New York Times editorial after he died, it basically says, "How dare Adam Powell besmirch the memory of Dr. King by dying on the anniversary of his death?" And he distrusted print reporters. The one the print network of print newspapers and magazines that he did trust was the black press. I learned to type as a 6 or 7 or 8 year old in my father's office, typing addressing the envelopes that went to the Pittsburgh Courier, the Afro American, the Chicago Defender, the Amsterdam News, because he wanted every week to send out press releases to them, to Jet, Ebony, all of the black publications all over the country, because he said those are the only ones that are going to give us the full story or the accurate story. Um, he used to say that people made up stuff all the time about him. Print reporters. He said they've made up stuff about me, and I remember almost laughing. There was a reporter for a major daily newspaper who filed a story with her editor, which was an interview with me. I had never met her. She made it up.
Wow, she made up the entire interview.
Yes.
Wow.
And the only reason it wasn't published is that the editor knew me. And he called me. He said, "Did you just talk to one of our reporters?" I said, "Who?" "Oh, yeah, I know the byline, but no, I've never met her." He said, "Oh, I thought so. I didn't think that you'd be using black English in an interview with our newspaper." I said, "I wouldn't use black English in an interview with the Afro-American." um, but so, and I hung up and I thought, I just remember my father saying all the time, "They make up stuff about me all the time." I said, "Well, there it is."
And how old were you at that time?
When the interview, in
Yes.
my interview,
Yeah.
let's see, I would have been in my 30s, I guess.
At the time when they this alleged when they were trying to print this false interview, when they were making up this false interview, how old were you?
I was in my 30s.
Oh, okay. Okay. Let me ask you this question. Now we're moving into the 1960s, of course. Um, what was your father's relationship? Because a great deal has been made about this, and we're going to get into this. What was your father's relationship like with uh, the policy bankers in Harlem? Uh, and, and 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 for those of us that are chronologically flawed, that are chronologically indicted, that are chronologically suffering. First of all, let's define, actually what we're talking about for those that in the Black community that are too young to remember. The numbers was primarily, if not solely, a Black enterprise. It was probably one of the most powerful Black enterprises that we've ever produced. Today, y'all call it the lottery. But back during that time, you could play a number, and the policy houses or the people that control the lottery were these policy houses being ran by these local neighborhood bankers. They called them, quote unquote, the numbers. I think that's the proper term for it.
And it was thoroughly illegal. This is before the government got into the gambling business with lotteries and other things. But I remember in New York, it was off-track betting. I think was the first government lottery, government gambling that came in.
Absolutely.
But
So
but the numbers, it's hard to describe now to people living today who weren't living then how ubiquitous the numbers were. Every barber shop, every beauty parlor, every bar, there was a numbers runner who would come by, and you could play the number. You'd say, okay, today's number is 717 or whatever, and if and everybody knew how to find the winning number. In New York, it was in the New York Daily News, and it was the last three digits of, I think it was Aqueduct Racetrack. It was one of the racetrack data. Here in Washington, D.C., the number was carried in, I think it was the Washington Daily News. And somebody who worked at the Daily News said that one day a very religious person became the editor of the newspaper and said, "Why do we highlight the total revenue of this racetrack?" And they said, "Well, people buy the newspaper to see that number." And he said, "Oh, we're encouraging gambling." And then he said, "We're going to stop doing that." And the circulation plunged. uh, um, and so much so that they had to reinstate doing it.
the numbers.
Um,
What was your
but
father's
they
relationship?
but the numbers was everywhere. So you're asking what my father's relationship is. His
Especially in
view
Harlem.
his view was that yes, you had the numbers runners, the people who ran the numbers, picked up your bets and paid off, um, were black in Harlem. But the people who really ran the numbers business were the white mobsters. And so I remember one time, this is going to sound crazy. One time he took me down to, it was a Saturday. We went down to a meeting in what is now a very chic part of Manhattan. It was the meatpacking district. And he said, son, I'm going to be meeting with a couple of people. Why don't you just hang out here for a minute? And I'll be out in a few minutes. And he goes in, and um, I needed to use the bathroom. So I asked somebody, I said, where's the bathroom? They said, oh, second door over there. You just go down the hall, second door. I said, I went down the hall, and I opened the wrong door. And inside was a closet with a huge sack full of cash.
Wow.
And that was, they'd been collecting their $1 and
That's
$2.
policy money.
Right.
Policy money.
And I thought, if I take $1 out of this, I could have my throat slit.
Right.
So I found the bathroom, came back, my father came out, and I said, so I said, I found the whole thing. He said, oh yeah, that's what they do here. He said, but the thing is, the white people take their cut. And what I told him is, that's not fair. We want to have more money for for black people in Harlem. But and he was notorious. It was one of the Daily News or the Daily Mirror, one of the tabloids. Of course, the New York Times would never report anything like that. But he was meeting with some mobster or other, saying, you've got to give a bigger cut to black people.
Wait. Stop. Let's let that marinate for a second. Adam Clayton Powell is meeting with a mobster, presumably someone in the structure of the five family mafia system. And he's telling them to give the black community in Harlem a bigger cut.
Right.
Okay. Go ahead,
and it was according to, I think it was the Daily Mirror, one of the tabloids. They said that as a result, the uptown, Harlem numbers people were going to get a little more money than they had before for doing what they were doing. But it was he would meet with anybody, and there was what was his name? I think he was a player for the New York Titans, I think was the name of the football team. I think it became the New York Jets later, but not the NFL New York Giants, but the other the New York team in the other football league. John Young, that was his name, John Young. And he said, Adam, if you thought it would do any good, you would go to hell and make a deal with the devil. And he looked, and my father looked up and said, I may do that.
Wow. Knowing his negotiation skill, he would probably be damn good at it. But now this enters a period where a very sketchy character enters the mix. A quote unquote supposed washer woman maid by the name of Esther James. I had a chance to have a sit down talk with a discussion with another Harlem historian. And this is probably going to be one of the major debacles. I thought it was rather petty after looking into it myself, but I could see that where Adam Clayton Powell Jr. is involved, it's always a bigger picture at play. There's always a larger scheme here going on that he's negotiating in terms of brokering power for African Americans, in terms of brokering opportunities for Black people in Harlem. Adam is right there in the mix, but this kind of sketchy figure enters the mix by the name of Esther James into the middle in the middle of this whole policy battle between Adam trying to wager more opportunity for African Americans in an illegal enterprise, by the way, in an illegal enterprise, to show you that this man had his pulse on the finger of Black America. Uh, at this time, he makes some statements that said, I believe he called Esther James a bag woman for the mafia. During that period, it's impossible for most Black people to know what kind of control the mafia had over vice in the Black community.
Well, remember what he was also going after corruption in the police
In
department.
the police department, which later came out with Frank Serpico, of course.
Right, right.
But
And so this is not just collecting money for the mob; it's also collecting for payoffs for the police.
it's interfering with the police's cut, as it would be. Again, Adam Clayton Powell is right in the mix of the hornet's nest. But it's during this time that it comes to Adam's attention that this woman is allegedly functioning as a bag woman for those forces that are controlling the numbers rack, those white Italian families that are controlling the numbers racket. And she's called out as a bag woman. Now, the irony is, according to some very reputable people, Esther James really was a bag woman, but he got into trouble saying that on air. I think it was. I think he gave an interview,
Yes,
and he's
and the legal issue was, and still is, that if a member of Congress says something on the floor of the House or Senate, he or she is legally protected. You can't sue a member of Congress for anything they say on the floor of the House or Senate. Um, he then repeated what he had said on the floor of the House in a television interview. And the legal issue was, was he protected or not? And he um, did not offer. Well, first, some lawyers said, "Adam, pay her off. It's not worth it. You settle for some trivial amount of money." And he said, "No, I'm right. I'm not going to pay her off." Um, and so it escalated. Um, he refused to appear in court to discuss it, and so he was held in contempt. And for a time, he could only come into the state of New York, the jurisdiction. He could only come into New York on Sundays, and so he would come to Newark and wait until 11:59, and then drive through the Lincoln Tunnel and get to Manhattan at 12:02, so that he could be in the pulpit that morning. And that went on for a time. Eventually, a compromise was reached, and he could come into New York all the time. Um, but I don't think anybody would disagree. If he were alive, I don't think he would disagree that the time that he could not come into Harlem really was problematic politically, because it let other people, black and white, take advantage of his absence.
well. Here's my thing, Adam. Is that it's almost a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation, because most of the Harlem community and most people knew that the accusations that Adam was making was true. Now, I'm aware of the fact that he made these statements to a reporter. But here's the thing: I don't know if it was that day. Maybe I need to do a little bit more research. There are two forms of immunity. There's absolute immunity and there's qualified immunity.
Oh,
And
you're getting all legal on us now.
yes, I'm getting legal on you. During, I know during this modern period, I don't know if this existed during the period of your dad. And the doctrine goes like this: it says anything you say on the floor of Congress, just like a lawyer, anything he says in court, he has absolute immunity for, right? If you step outside of that purview and you say it like to a reporter, or you say it like at um, any famous soul food restaurant in Harlem during that period, if you say it, you don't have absolute immunity. You have something called qualified immunity. And it is a lesser version of absolute immunity, but you're still protected. And so what it says is this: it says, okay, you're still protected. The only thing is they have to show that you had malice aforethought when you made the statement. So you still have the protection of immunity, but that immunity can be attacked now if they can show you did it recklessly, if they can show you did it with willful indifference. And that would have been my linchpin for defending Adam Clayton Powell Sr.
Well,
Now,
the
Junior,
other thing that his lawyers
oh,
wanted to do was to um, introduce proof that she was indeed a bag woman, and that would be. I mean, you're talking about libel here,
yeah, truth is a
and
defense to that,
right,
right? Truth
right.
is a defense to slander. So my thing is, but I will wager that the people that he would need, or he would have needed to be most convincing, and I'm sure they probably could have made a case either way. The people that would have been most convincing would be the police. But the police, of course, is pissed off.
Right.
So they're not going to come to court and testify for him because they're pissed off with him because he's actually pointing to corruption in the New York City Police Department. So uh, when I listen to that, when I look at the Esther James situation, I look at it through those lenses. Okay, first of all, you're doing some scandalous shit here, Miss James. You're gonna get away with doing some scandalous stuff here, but then by the same token, you want to sue the congressman for pointing out that you're doing some scandalous stuff here. And it was like, to me, it was like, okay, the nerve. It was like, how dare you? And again, the Harlem community, everyone in Harlem knew that this woman was really a bad woman. Everyone knew. I think it was Wyatt Walker in the documentary on your father that PBS did. He said the irony was the woman really was a bag lady. And I'm like, okay, if that's the irony, what are we doing here? Why are we in court? And what is this BS? And why are we continuing to go through this? But then I had to step back and I said, okay, this is political. Uh,
Well,
Adam,
people are also asking who's paying her legal bills.
exactly. Somebody asked that question: who was paying her legal bills? And the likely candidates would have been organized crime. It would have been a sector of the New York Police Department, all of Adams' adversaries, because there's no way a washerwoman could afford those attorneys. There's no way a maid in Harlem could afford the finest attorneys that New York would have to offer during that period. So, when you look at something like that, you clearly see, okay, and some people say, well, oh, you just think he's without blemish. And no, 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 no. Adam Clayton Powell, he was subject to high forms of playerism, as the young folks would call it. We ain't got to lie about that. We ain't got to lie about that. But when it comes to, this, oh, he's slandering me. No, 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 you're a bag lady. He was telling the truth. And so this is one of the instances that a lot of the liberals and later conservatives would use to try to mar his legacy, to stain his legacy in terms of what he meant for Black America, in terms of what he meant for Black people. But I just found it odd that he was actually telling the truth, And the man got in trouble for telling them not all of the other stuff that you would think they would be upset about, which they would be understandably upset about. The thing with what was the guy he sat next to,
Oh
and
yes, Rankin.
Rankin, not
Yeah.
for what he did with Rankin, not for what he did with desegregating the dining establishments of Congress, not with being the quote unquote, as he would call it, an irritant, a burr under their saddle, as it would be. Not all those things. They're going to put this man in front of the firing squad for putting on blast a washerwoman. Out of all the things, a washerwoman. And so, I looked at that and I said, okay, this was really much ado about nothing. Did he, in fact, wind up paying something, or did he not pay her anything, or what happened with that litigation?
I don't remember the exact details, but he did pay something fairly trivial, and because I remember when it happened, they said, you could have made this go away, and he said, oh, he said, but I was right. Um, and
I concur, Adam. I concur. He was right. I concur. He was right. He was right.
and that's actually very much a part of his strength. That if he thought he was right about jobs, about equal pay, about anything, if he thought he was right, he would just keep going. And uh, there's um, there's the film clip at the beginning of the documentary you mentioned earlier, where he says that if I'm right, and I know I am, um, and you put your hand in God's hand, and there's nothing that can stop you. And that was very much a core of his belief and his action.
Okay, what I want to do
We've
now.
we've we've
Go ahead.
we've now done another hour. It looks like we may have to come back and do another one and
Oh
talk
no,
about the
no,
last 2 years.
we're not going to drag you out. We're going to go ahead and finish out today. It's only a few more points that I want to cover. What I want to do is I want to show you this clip of this individual, and I want your feedback on this man. If you know, in fact, who he was, your feedback on him and his accusations as it relates to your father. Give me just one moment. We're going to cue up the film.
Ah,
He was down there with a glass in one hand and a woman in the other hand. And I don't think it's incumbent upon us as responsible members of the House to belabor ourselves with a man with an attitude such as that.
He's demonstrated over and over again, in my judgment, that he is not a suitable person to participate in enacting laws to govern the people of this country.
Adam Power is a symbol that all black people can organize around.
Your response, sir.
yeah. Basically, what happened is that um, the segregationists and other opponents in Congress saw an opportunity, and he responded um, um, both as a parliamentarian, knowing the congressional procedure, but also, again, to demonstrate what the facts were. And Congressman Seller from Brooklyn was appointed to lead a committee of the House to look into charges that um, other members of Congress had brought against him, like the two that you just saw. And the report of the Seller committee was that they could find that almost everything that was said against him, wasn't true. It had no basis in fact, and that just didn't matter.
Well, let me ask you something before you. The first person that you saw, wasn't he subsequently brought up on some type of charges,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
and everything stuck as it
Yeah.
relates to him. But when it relates to Adam, it was untrue in Adam's case, but absolutely true in his case.
Well, I was actually in school up at MIT, and they sent an investigator up to interview me about the possible illegal financial dealings, and they wanted to know, well, who paid for your Eastern Airlines shuttle ticket to go to New York? I did. What do you mean? Who paid for it? I paid for it. Oh, it wasn't paid for by Congress. No, no. In those days, you paid for your shuttle ticket on the plane. I said, no, there's no member of Congress sitting there paying me or paying my way. I said, oh, what about this bill? I said, I paid that bill myself. You want to see my check? So there were all kinds of things that they were investigating, and they had trouble finding anything um, that would stick. The problem that he had, and I remember when they had the vote, eventually there's a vote to exclude him
From
from
Congress,
Congress.
right?
And a lot of people thought it was going to be close. And he lost um, close to 300 of the 435 members voted against him. And I was actually up in the gallery watching from above. And so the vote happens. I ran down and joined him as he walked out of the House chamber. And other members of Congress, were coming up and bumping into him, like jostling him. What is going on? And we got to the steps outside of the House of Representatives. And I said, what was all that about? And he said, they couldn't be seen talking with me, but they were stuffing things in my pocket. I said, what? And he reached into his pocket, and it was bulging with little pieces of paper, and he took them out and said, we're with you, Adam, from somebody who just voted against him.
Wow.
And he'd take another one. And these were people who he thought were his friends.
Right.
They'd been reliable votes in civil rights. They'd split bottles of scotch together. They'd traveled together. And now they couldn't be seen with him. And that, he just had a look of disgust on his face. And as you know, he ran for re-election, was re-elected without spending any money.
Without spending any money while he was in the Caribbean, right?
Right. And the Supreme Court of the United States eventually ruled that what happened was unconstitutional. This is something which Powell versus McCormick. He sued.
McCormick, yes.
He sued Speaker of the House of Representatives, Speaker McCormick, and I was there for the Supreme Court argument. It was really quite something. The House of Representatives had hired a very noted constitutional lawyer who said, if Adam Clayton Powell had brought an axe into the House chamber and had beheaded another member of Congress, this court would not have jurisdiction under separation of powers. And I remember the gasp in the Supreme Court chamber.
Wow.
He said, this court has no jurisdiction on any action taken by the House of Representatives. And then Arthur Kenoy, the lead constitutional lawyer in my father's team, he got up and very carefully walked through precedents, and the justices, Supreme Court justices, had lots of questions. In fact, the House lawyer's statement was in response to one of the justices who asked, "What do you think is the jurisdiction that this court has in this case?" And he said, "If you beheaded somebody, there'd be no, you couldn't do anything." Earl Warren was the Chief Justice, and we later heard from one of the clerks. They're not supposed to tell you this sort of thing, but that Warren wanted to make this a decisive opinion. There would be no middle ground here, and it was. And so my father was reinstated. They said that what you could do is you could suspend somebody. So now you have Congressman Santos from New York, who's accused of all kinds of illegal activities. They can't exclude him, but they can suspend him if they want. So in any event, so the House had to reinstate my father, and they took away his committee chairmanship, took away his seniority, made him pay a fine. Those things were within their power, but they couldn't keep him out of Congress.
And I think they owed him some $80,000 during the period that he was.
Yes.
And he didn't get a penny of that back, did he?
No.
Wow. And of course, you guys can look up that court decision, Powell v. McCormick. You can Google it. It's actually online. You can download it and read it. He subsequently won re-election 2 times without spending a penny, without even being in the country. That shows you, how powerful this man's influence was in Harlem. But the thing for me now is knowing this and knowing who would come after him. Of course, Charlie Rangel took that seat and would hold that seat for some time. Let's talk now as we close out here. Let's talk about the legacy of Adam Clayton Powell. Let's talk about how he's been depicted in popular media. The best.
Well, there's the cartoon character that's in Godfather of Harlem. I mean, that's like something out of a cartoon. So little relationship to anything. There's the movie, television movie Rustin, which I finally saw. And after a lot of people said, this is really one person said, a very harsh depiction. They were looking for a villain of some kind, and the writers came up with having your father as a villain. Well, it's interesting. There's some filmmakers and others, journalists, and people in Harlem who contacted me, but who are upset with this. And one of them, I don't want to use any names yet because I think they're about to come out with something publicly. I mean, Charlie Rangel called me up and said, "We've got to have a news conference about this." And Charlie, when Godfather of Harlem started, that was the first time he called me. And I said, "Charlie, this is on some cable network that nobody gets. If we have a news conference, you're only going to be increasing the audience for that show." But now with Rustin, some filmmakers and historians and others are getting together to have a response, which is not going to say that. I mean, Barack Obama is the executive producer of the Rustin movie. It's not going to say that.
Whoa! Stop! Did you just say that Barack Obama is the executive producer of the Rustin movie that's on Netflix? Did you say that?
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm just, you have to forgive me, Adam. I'm just letting that sink in for a second because that's kind of heavy here. Here's a man that is essentially riding on the coattails of Adam Clayton Powell. Okay. Okay, that shook me for a moment. I didn't know that. I did not know that. I saw the rest of the movie. I thought it was interesting. It's always good to see the background of what happened. But I was never a Rustin fan, although I can appreciate his contributions. Um, but to learn that puts an entirely different spin on the whole argument. I'm sorry. Continue.
Well, Hollywood. You always have creators, writers, directors who want to create a compelling story. And in fact, the last course that I taught at USC before I quote unquote retired was a course which was created by the former dean, Jeff Cowan, documentary versus docudrama. And what we would do every week, the course met once a week for 3 hours, is first half of each course would be, here's a depiction of a real historical event as it was recorded in journalism, in history books, in documentaries, then take a break and then come back. And the second half would be, here's the same thing depicted in a Hollywood movie or an opera or a novel. And over the course of the 17 weeks, the students in the course, I think, were convinced that the closer you get to what actually happened, the story gets better, which I think is actually the movie that my brother and I co-produced about our father, Keep the Faith, Baby.
I was going to say that one
the
was the best one by far.
Well, the screenwriter for that was Art Washington, and he spent years in doing research. And he would say all the time, he'd say, the closer I get to what actually happened, the better this movie is going to be. And so if you go to Keep the Faith, Baby, which is also on Netflix, Harry Lennox does a great job depicting him. He campaigned for the role of depicting my father. This is before he was a big star. And Vanessa Williams plays my mother, and they would be in makeup for hours to appear more like them. But the only thing in the movie that didn't happen was the only scene in the movie with me in it, or somebody playing me. And it's because Art and the others couldn't figure out a way of showing, from my father's point of view, how my parents broke up. And so they created this. I thought it was the way it really happened was that my father, my mother was in Europe. My father and I came back for me to be at school, for him to be in the pulpit, and she kept touring in Europe, playing concerts. And she would send telegrams saying, Felix, or European manager, has, if I stay just 2 more weeks, he can get me Sao Playal. If I stay just 2 more weeks, he can get me the Palladium in London, so on, which would be a lot of money.
You know what was the coldest line for me, Adam? I mean, the coldest. I mean, in terms of relationships. I mean, this line was colder than a pimp's heart to me. Is when he breaks up with Bunny Girl, which is his first wife, and she's asking why. And this has to be one of the greatest breakup lines I've ever heard. This is the coldest way I've ever heard a man break up with a woman. Adam says, quote, once upon a time I was chasing you, then I caught you, then I passed you, and now I can't sustain the distance. I was like, oh, that's cold. Oh, that's cold. That to me is one of the coldest breakup lines ever uttered by a guy to a woman. But let me ask you this. In terms of that movie, clearly, unless I missed my point, that movie as compared to Godfather in Harlem, it finds Godfather in Harlem's depiction wanting as it relates to your father. The Rustin depiction, again, in accordance with, unless I'm missing this here, it is wanting in relationship to your father. Is it fair to say that the only balanced depictions of him are the actual documentary and the movie that you made? Is there something somewhere else?
Not that I know of. I learned um, Warrington Hudlin, a great director, told me that in 1994 or 95, uh, senior people in Warner Brothers came to him wanting to do a theatrical feature about my father, and he said, "Great, this is a dream come true. I'd love to do it." And they had some meetings in Burbank, and and of course, small world. I had been an executive producer at Warner Brothers 4 years earlier and had no idea this was going on. But in any event, so it finally didn't happen. There were some casting issues. My father was once asked when the movie in 1956 or 7 or 8, the movie Advise and Consent came out. And I remember going to a news conference. I was in the back of the room, and one of the reporters asked my father, "Congressman, we understand that there's a character in this movie that's based on you. Is that true?" And he was puffing on a cigar, and he looked up. "Well, who could play me? Cesar Romero?" And who I guess now is probably known, to the extent he's known at all, is or playing the Joker on
The
Batman,
Joker.
the TV
Yeah,
series. Um,
absolutely.
but actually, that was one of the big issues in Hollywood was who was going to play Adam Clayton Powell, and people thought, oh, I remember in one meeting, someone said, "Oh, Jimmy Smith, we'll go Latino." So stranger things have happened, but yes, as far as I know, those are the two um, uh, really good, uh, solid depictions. Not only and in the documentary, you have to stay with it to the very end when Shirley Chisholm just looks up. Uh, and has one of the great closing lines of any documentary. She just looks up and just says, "Oh, Adam." And I can't do it the way she did, but it's really, really well done.
There's
It was
always
nominated. It was nominated for an Academy Award, not
wow.
an Emmy, not a TV Emmy. It was nominated for an Academy Award
The
by the
documentary was.
yes, by Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Why? Because it ran first in theaters before it ran on PBS in
Oh,
American Experience.
okay. Um, this I don't know if this is fact or fictional. It is said that your father was working on quote unquote a textbook
Yeah.
of how Congress really operates, and some people called it a get back book. And on the eve of either his funeral or his death, his office was burglarized. And I think what was stolen was like his medal given to him by Haile Selassie and several other things. Is that true, or was that dramatic license?
That's dramatic license. I was there. I flew down to Miami on the first flight after he died, um, and I flew to Bimini on that morning on the first flight on Chalk's seaplane service, and I went to the house. He was working on a book about. He called it a textbook of politics. A textbook for students. Um, and he had asked for all of his papers from Congress to be sent to Bimini so that he could work on the book. Um, and there was a strong feeling, suspicion, belief in Washington that among the papers he had in his office, which were shipped to Bimini, was a black loose leaf notebook in which he kept accounts of which members of Congress had been bribed to do what and on which days. And in his office, right after that exclusion vote, when we got back to his office in the House Rayburn House office building, some people on his staff said, "Adam, release the book, make the book public." And he said, "No, no, no." He never admitted the book existed. No, no, no. If something like that were made public, it would only make the United States look bad. So he had everything shipped to Bimini. So I arrived at the house at 7:30 in the morning. No other flights had come in. I walked over to the house, and I thought there was a bird sitting on the window. And as I got closer, I could see, no, it's not a bird sitting on the window. Somebody had smashed a hole through the window and had opened the front door. And inside, cash was sitting there. Valuables were sitting there because he'd left the house very quickly to go to the hospital. But all his papers, boxes and boxes of papers, were all gone. And we thought also, including as late as whatever year the movie was made, decades later, that they'd also taken the medallion. It turns out he hid the medallion. It was only found recently. He hid it in a plastic baggie inside a can of white paint. And it was found a couple of years ago by somebody who wanted to open up the can of white paint and use it and paint something. And he found this bag inside with the medallion. So the medallion he successfully hid. The papers, all gone. I keep getting contacted by different people who want to have access to my father's papers. It's all gone. I mean, Abyssinia Church has a few, but all of his papers from Washington were all gone. And if you've seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, at the very end, the Ark of the Covenant is taken to a government warehouse and is put up in a storage in a huge warehouse. Well, we think that's probably where the papers are. They're sitting in some government warehouse.
Wow. Wow. So the textbook never saw the light of day.
No.
He could have quite literally destroyed these people.
Oh, yeah.
And he chose not to do it. They lied on him, but he told the truth on them. And his papers were mysteriously burglarized, gone. So we found the medal. We know that that's still here. So with all that being said, what do you think, as we come to a close here, what do you think, or what should you think the legacy of Adam Clayton Powell Jr. is?
Well, the problem now, and this is where some historians and journalists and filmmakers are getting involved. The problem now is that there are these other depictions of him that are out there. And for a current and future generations who not only weren't alive during my father's lifetime, but also may not know very much. I mean, there's not much about him in they teach in history classes.
There's nothing
Right.
about him in history classes.
So
when we were in school, very quickly, when we were in school, it was three seminal figures. It was Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Luther King Jr. Anything else, you had to go outside and find it. I didn't find out about Adam Clayton Powell until Meet the Press ran one of his interviews from, I think it was the 60s. They ran one of his interviews, the 50s or 60s. They ran one of his interviews. And so at that time, I'm like, okay, who is this white guy? And my grandma said, he's not white. He's not white. I mean, she took supreme offense to that. She was like, he's not white. That's Adam Clayton Powell. He's the greatest politician that black folks ever had. And I'm like, he looked like a white man. Now, again, this is me at the time and younger, not being aware of the politics of, light-skinned, as we called it, politics, the politics of passing and whatnot, not being aware of that. And then later on in 1989, coming across that documentary, or actually 91, 2 years later, coming across that documentary. It's very difficult to get that kind of information. You have to wait till you get to college before you get, and I often say that they wait till you go to college before they start telling you the truth. You don't get the truth until you have to pay for it, right? Until you have to go into debt. They'll give you the truth. You get the truth, but you have to go into debt to get it. And that's the first time I actually had heard that he was even a part of it. But I saw him in another documentary, which you may be familiar with. He was briefly in Eyes on the Prize.
Yes. Yeah.
Briefly in there. I saw him in there. And then there's an interview that he did with New York journalist, the late, great Gil Noble. There was that interview. But there just isn't much information on Adam if you don't go and look for it. And of course, they're not going to have near the amount of information that the Schomburg would have in New York City.
Well, November 29th is my father's birthday, and what Gil Noble used to do on Channel 7 on ABC in New York is every year run a 1-hour documentary about my father. And he did that every year until he retired.
Wow. My history professor in college knew your father, had actually met your father. And he talked about one of the things, he jokingly talked about his penchant for scotch.
Oh, yeah.
And his eyes. Shout out to the great William Ward, the mayor of Chesapeake. I don't know if he's still the mayor of Chesapeake. He was at the time when I was at Norfolk State. But that kind of information, I think we're losing that. I mean, outside of people like, let's say, yourself, we're losing that. So can we still get the book, Adam by Adam? Can we still get that book?
I believe you can on Amazon. I think they actually are getting ready to do another printing of it. And on that note, I'm afraid I'm going to have to sign off. So thank you very much for
Let us close out. We were getting ready to
session.
close out. Absolutely. We're getting ready to close out. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for another session of Center of the Board, Adam Clayton Powell. We want to thank him for coming in here this hour and 42, 36, and 37 seconds for hanging out with us and giving us this second and final edition. Once again, where can people find you? Just so.
Well, the easy thing is just to do a search. You can find me on search. I'm even though I retired in 2010, I'm still running our 50 state, now 4-continent election cybersecurity project at the University of Southern California. So if you go to usc.edu, you can find me there.
Okay, well, again, that's going to have to do it. Thank you guys for tuning in and hanging out with us. And as always, be good to one another, but don't forget to be good to yourself. This is Mr. Tony Maceo saying, keep the faith, baby.